Hi, and welcome to Photoshop tutorial number 5. This tutorial is about layers and layer groups. So we'll cover the basics, introduce you to how those things work, and as we start learning some other techniques in future tutorials, you may learn a few more things about layers as we actually apply them, but at least this will provide you with a basic understanding of knowledge of how to create them, how to use them, as well as layer groups, and some of the things you can do and ways in which layers make your life a lot easier in Photoshop. If you're familiar with creating drawings with layers of trace paper, layers in Photoshop work quite the same way. They were actually introduced way back in 1994 in version 3 of Photoshop. And previous to that, you actually had to create selections and save paths, and it really made doing photo montage difficult. Of course, layers now, they really serve the purpose of isolating different parts of the drawing, just like layers of trace paper do. And be able to make changes to one part of a drawing without changing other parts of it. But of course, in Photoshop, in the digital world, it really goes way beyond that. So you can apply adjustments, you can select things by layer, transform them, hide or show them, duplicate them. And really, layers allow you to draw much more quickly, apply color much more loosely. And so it gives you a lot more freedom to experiment, to try something. If it doesn't work, if it's on a separate layer, it's easy to erase or modify however you like. And in reality, although it can be a little bit of extra work up front, understanding and using layers effectively is really just as important as understanding how to set up brushes and your drawing technique, because it really keeps things organized. It allows you to have much more freedom, as I mentioned, in how you put paint on. And it makes it just a lot more versatile for making changes later on, which we always do. So the first thing I want to look at is the layers panel. That's really where we get most of this information. And I'll use this wonderful drawing on the screen here to kind of demonstrate some of that. If you don't see your layers panel icon open, if I stretch this out, you can see it's just a little kind of stacked sheets of paper. I usually keep my icons collapsed. If you don't see it there, you can go to the window menu and choose layers or hit F7 as a keyboard shortcut. Okay, so here's a layers panel for this document, and I've got a few layers set up that already have these colors placed on them, and I've got some blank ones that are unnamed that we'll look at in a little bit. So the basic anatomy of this panel is that at the top, one of the new features that's been added is the ability to sort layers. And I'm not going to get into this right now. This is a little more advanced, but it does allow you to sort it by name, by kind. We're going to leave it at the default setting right now. And there's a few other options you can set for that. So we'll get back to those in a future tutorial. But for right now, we're just going to leave this on kind. Next down, we've got some settings for the layer mode, and we'll look at this in a little bit, a couple of those settings, the opacity of the layer, the fill of the layer, and then some different options for locking, which we'll also take a look at in just a little bit. We've got the layers themselves, and you'll notice the icons have several parts to them. There's a preview, a thumbnail of what's on the layer name itself here, and this is a visibility icon. And later on, when we get into understanding and using layer masks, there'll actually be a second icon that represents the layer mask. And so that makes it important to understand which part of this. And actually, if you click on the layer icon, you can see there's one set of context menus. If you click on the name of the layer part of this, then you get a completely different menu. So it really is important to understand that these are significantly different parts of the layer icon representation, and depending on where you put your cursor, you're going to get a different set of submenus that pop up. And we'll experiment with this in just a little bit. If we move down to the bottom, you can see there's some other icons. This is how we can delete a layer, we can add a layer. This is for a layer group, which I'll show you how to create. This is for an adjustment layer, and this is for a layer mask, and this is for a layer styles. We won't get into layer styles in this tutorial or layer masks. That will come in the future, but or adjustment layers, but at least show you how to create new layers and layer groups and delete them. Okay, also, as I mentioned last time in the tutorial on brushes, every one of these panels, standard interface feature has a pop-up menu. So that's something you should just, again, be aware of. If you want to change the panel options, you can adjust the thumbnail size. I have mine set on small. Probably it's better to keep it on small or none. If you're well organized and have good names in your layers, the thumbnail really doesn't show you much, and it actually does slow Photoshop down a little bit because it has to generate that as you paint and change things. It updates every one of those icons. So, if we look over here, you can see this, that, well, maybe that's helpful, but if these were plan symbols or colors over a drawing and I knew what they were, I don't really need to see the preview because I can turn it off and on and see the image in front of me anyway. So if you're using this on computers not quite as fast, you might want to turn those off, and that will speed things up. For now, I'll leave it at the default. Okay, so that's the basic layout of the layers panel itself. And a couple things just to mention also, I might demonstrate this as we move through. As I mentioned, there's some lock options here. So I can lock a layer like this, and it allows me to still move it up and down in the layer stacking. So I'll just demonstrate this down here. If we have the blue, if I move that below the green, you can see that now the green's over top of that. If I move it below the red's over top of that. So the stacking order is just like pieces of paper, tracing paper stacked up on, or acetate sheets that you stack up over top of each other. So that's important if you want to be able to make sure one layer covers up something else below it. We can use that stacking. We can also, turn that off a second. We can also lock things like transparent pixels. So if I lock the transparent pixel on the blue and I get a brush, let me change the color here to something like yellow. As I paint over this, it's painting wherever the blue paint exists, but you can see that it's not letting me paint outside that. Since I locked all the transparent pixels on that layer, I can only paint the new color where there's actually an existing color pixel on the layer. So sometimes that can be really helpful. If you've got something already drawn on a layer, you want to edit it, change the color, do something to it, and you want to do it very quickly. Or if I wanted to, let's say I wanted to get a smaller brush and do some kind of white line highlight over top of that, I can go back and forth and add that as a texture, and it will only show up there, and it won't show up anywhere else once it goes beyond that. Now, in this case, this brush that I was painting on actually has kind of a blurred, dithered edge, so you can see that it fades, even the white kind of fades out. It doesn't look like there's anything there, but there actually is a little bit of lightly faded color underneath there. So this means you can lock the painted pixels, which means I can add to the transparent areas, but I can't affect anything that's there. This locks movement, so you can't move it back and forth, and this locks everything. So you can turn some of these on, like this one and this one, this one and this one at the same time, but other ones, I can't lock the transparent and the paint pixels together, or basically I'm locking everything anyway. So it will tell you if you can toggle things off and on. Okay, so that's the layers panel. And again, remember that the positions in the layer stack determine what covers up what. So if whatever's on top covers up what's below. So this is the top layer of paper, this is the bottom layer of paper. And by moving those around, I can change the order in which they're displayed. Okay, let's talk a little bit about layer groups, because as you can see here, it doesn't take long if you have a complex document and you have lots of layers, which as we move through some exercises, you're going to see that. It just gets to be kind of cumbersome. And by the way, you can resize this. So if your layers, you can scroll up and down, but if you have a bigger screen, I usually just pull this down so I can see as many layers as possible, because as soon as I fold it back up, it disappears anyway, and that means I don't have to scroll around within a really small viewing window. Okay, there's a layer group is simply a way to collect layers together in a folder, and that's what this icon is here. And I can create a new layer group by clicking on that folder, and I'll start with these top three, which we'll come back to later. So I can click on that, and again, to select layers, you can control click to select layers that aren't adjacent to each other. But if you wanted to select all three, I can click on the top one, hold shift, click on the bottom one, and it selects all three. To put them in the layer group, I just simply click and drag, and you'll notice that If I move up here, I get a line. That means I'd actually be dropping those layers above the layer group. If I pull down, you can see how there's a rectangle around that layer group icon, and that's what I want. And if you did your job right, when you click on this arrow, they should disappear or fold up into the layer group. Now you can rename any of these things. If you just double click on the name, I'll call this new group. And the same is true for the layers. If you really wanted to label this something else, I'll call that green 2. You just double click on the name and type in what you want there. Okay, now another way to make layer groups, and I'll demonstrate that with this group, is I'm going to again click on the first one, hold the shift key down, click on the second one, and I can come up to our panel menu and say new group from layers. All right, so then I'm going to call this original layers and just click OK. So now I have all those inside that layer group. And one of the nice things, besides organizing your layers panel so you don't have to look at all the layers at one time, you can also turn all those off with a single click. Instead of going through and clicking this one and this one and this one, I can leave all those on, and then I can just turn that off and on with one option. I can also select a layer group and move those objects around, and now because I've got the whole group, they all move together. There actually is another way to do that by linking the layers, but layer groups actually make that a little bit easier. If I come down here, I'm just moving that layer, but if I select my layer group, then I can move everything together. So a lot of times you have several layers that represent different layers of rendering on a drawing, and maybe you want to shift those. That gives you an easy way to do that. So layer groups are really useful, and you can make as many levels of hierarchy as you want. So I can take this layer group and drag it inside of that one, and now I've got these 3 layers, and I also have a layer group which has other layers inside of it. So that means that you can create that kind of hierarchy. If you want to move it out, you just drag it up till I see the line, and now those are 2 separate groups. So organization into layer groups and layer group hierarchy will be something we'll be using a lot when we do renderings, particularly plan drawings and perspectives, other things that are more complex. If you're just sketching, probably not that important, but if you're doing color over top of other original drawings, particularly if you export PDFs from AutoCAD or someplace where you're going to have a whole bunch of stacked black and white layers, you want to keep those separate, and then another stack of color layers that you're adding over top of that. Okay, so that's kind of the basics of layer groups. Pretty straightforward. There's a couple ways you can make a new layer group from scratch and add files to it. You can select layers and then choose new group from layers from the menu. And you can move these layers in and out by just dragging them in and out. One thing is important. I'm going to create another layer group. So if this is closed and that's selected and I create a new layer, which I can do from down here, it just jumps to the top of it. I'm going to undo that. If I have the layer group icon open and selected, okay, it has to be open and selected, and click on this, you'll see that it puts that new layer right inside the layer group. So that's also convenient if you're trying to keep some new layers organized by layer group. Just make sure you have it selected. You can also do the same thing by selecting a layer inside the group and clicking the new layer icon here, the little turn corner page, and it will automatically put it, it always puts the new layer above whatever layer is selected. But if you have a layer group selected and there's nothing in it, you just have to make sure the triangle is pointing down, that it's opened up, and then it'll add that to there. The best way to approach using layers in that respect is to try and be organized up front. So you really think about those layers, create them first, get them organized, and then name them as you go. The reality is that most of us, when we work, we kind of lose track of that. But every once in a while, once you've got enough work done, stop, save your file, go back here and say, okay, yeah, this is large trees, base color, or something like that. And as you go, otherwise, if you end up with a whole bunch of layers that just have layer 4, layer 5, layer 6, layer 7, and sometimes they may not have much information in them, and the preview doesn't really tell you what it is, and then you'll have to go through and turn these off and on to figure out what exactly is showing. Okay, so that's kind of how we'll talk about another thing I could talk about a little bit. Let's go down to our original layers here. are these layer modes. Mostly what we're going to be using for right now is the normal mode, which means if the paint was put on as opaque color, the layer will maintain that opacity. You can have an opaque layer with semi-transparent paint, and it will be semi-transparent like you can see here. But if I set this to multiply, you'll see that it actually interacts with the paint underneath there. So it's making the darker colors darker, and it's adding the color in. That's kind of like, again, putting marker. I think I mentioned this in the brush tutorial. It's like putting marker over some other black and white drawing where it intensifies the dark areas. So we can do that with a brush, but we can also do it with a layer. So for the most part, we're going to keep layers on normal because that allows one layer to cover another layer up if we start shifting things around, and that gives us some flexibility, as you'll see when we get into something like plan renderings. So keep that in mind. You can adjust these layer modes, but for right now, we're going to either use normal or we're going to use multiply, and we can experiment with some of these other ones a little bit later. Okay, a few things about using layers and layer groups, like what can we do with them? Well, one of the things you can do is without making a selection, we can make copies. So right now I have the blue layer selected. If I get my move tool and hold the Alt key down, I actually can pull a copy of that layer off. And you'll see when I come back, now I have blue and I have blue copy. And now that's completely separate. So if I wanted to slide that over, if I wanted to pull that down below the green, I can shift the layer. So that gives me a really quick way to make duplicate copies. Let's see, the blue copy here. We'll get into transformations later, but I can, turn that upside down, move it again over here, overlap it a little bit. And those are still completely separate elements. So I can turn this one off, or I can turn this one on and off. Okay, so that's one of the things you can do. If you only want part of a layer, let's say we want to copy some of this green layer. I'm going to take this corner, I'm just going to make a selection, and I want that to be on a new layer. I want to actually cut that out. Well, I can go to the layer menu, go to new, layer via cut. Now when you look at it, it doesn't look any different, but now you can see I have a new layer that actually just has that piece, and it's completely seamless with what's underneath there. So instead of duplicating an entire layer, we can take just a piece, and we can do that either as a cut or as a copy and maintain the original, but just put a copy of it up there. So that's another really useful function that layers allow us to do. I mentioned already that being able to lock the transparency and paint over the color on a layer without affecting anything else. We'll actually use that technique in photo montage to create shadows based on an image that we've used to say we pasted a tree into a photograph, and you'll see how that works later. And then one of the things about layers is they do add a lot of file size, which is okay for the most part. The computers have lots of memory and they can handle that. The biggest file I've had has been like 100 layers. So again, the need for layer groups to organize them, but ultimately once you're done editing, having multiple layers is a good thing because it allows you to edit and work a lot faster. But at some point I could decide that, well, layer blue, layer 5, and layer green here, I can really put those on the same layer because I'm not making any more changes to them. So I can select them and just say merge layers. And now you can see all that has been pulled down to one layer instead of been on several layers. So that's also a really useful thing to do. But again, I'd caution you not to do that until you're pretty much done with something and you know you don't need those extra layers for editability. And again, when we start doing photo montage work, you'll see why that's important. So that's basically an overview of how we use the layers. I've provided a file that goes along with this that you can follow along. So if you want to run through this using this file with these paint layers in it, and you can add your own paint layers with it. So get familiar with the layers panel, understand how to create layers, create layer groups, how you can move them up and down, how you can adjust the visibility, and you'll have a good start on the working knowledge you need to start rendering in Photoshop.